Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today. We're really looking forward to this online webinar. So today you've joined us for our cybersecurity event, which is focusing on cyber awareness and ransomware. So just a few things to note for this event. We are recording this session, so just to let you know, and this will be uploaded onto our IoD YouTube channel, and that will be shared with everybody post-event as well. And what we'll do today is the Q&A box at the bottom there. If you put any questions that you might have, please pop them in there. We'll moderate that throughout the event and then use those to answer at the end. And today we are joined by, we've got two people joining us today. So we've got Darren Chapman. So Darren's the owner of Cyberscale, and he's also our very own Norfolk ambassador for cyber and information security. So you'll be hearing from Darren first. And we also have Jake Hume, who we're really excited about. So he's joined us from the Cyber Prevent and Protect, and he's at the Serious Fraud and Cyber Unit for Hertfordshire Police. So you'll be hearing from both of those today. And as I say, any questions, pop them in the Q&A. So without further ado, I will hand over to Darren. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Cassie. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us this afternoon and taking some time out of your day for what I think is obviously a very important subject. We're going to talk, let me just pop my presentation up as well so you can see the slides. So we're going to talk a little bit about cyber security and cyber crime this afternoon. Cassie, can you see my slides okay? Just to double check.
Yep, we're all good.
Yeah, lovely, thank you. So we're going to talk about cybersecurity, we're going to talk about cybercrime, and particularly a little bit of emphasis on ransomware, which, as you probably know, is one of the kind of main types of cybercrime that we see out in particularly the business community at the moment. I'm going to talk about ransomware at a reasonably high level, and some of the things that we can do around that. And then Jake's going to follow on from me. I'd like to have Jake joining us. He's going to give a policing perspective on it and a little bit more detail around some of the things that I'm going to mention as well. So there's a few questions we're going to try and answer through the session today. So firstly, just a little bit of a primer on what ransomware is and how it fits into the cybercrime, cybersecurity picture. Information on how ransomware works, what the potential impact of ransomware is, why it happens. So we're going to talk there a little bit about motivations, but also about some of the vulnerabilities that exist in organizations and IT systems that allow ransomware attacks to happen, and then some information about what can or should you do about it to try and prevent ransomware attacks and also make your organizations more resilient to them as well. So very first question is, what is ransomware? Probably everybody knows already, but we will just clarify. But before I do that, I'm just going to talk a little bit about a fundamental concept of cyber and information security. So as a cybersecurity professional, one of the things that we're always very focused on is this. There's a thing called the CIA triad, and CIA in this case, it's about confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So when we're looking at systems and we're looking at the data stored within those systems, which is the thing that's really important to most of us, we're looking at these three key aspects, and a cyber attack of some kind will generally affect one or more of these aspects of systems and data. So confidentiality is the data that you have accessible only to the people who should have access to it. So have you locked it down? Have you got the right access controls around it? The integrity of the data is the data as it should be? Has it been altered in some way? So that could be bank details, it could be code for an application. If it's altered in some way, then that's an attack on the integrity of the data or the system, and obviously that can cause different types of problems. And then you've got the availability. So is the system, is the data available to you? Is it available to your customers at the time that you need it? Bearing in mind that the world we live in today, we might need access to a lot of our data on a 24/7 basis. So cyber attacks will generally impact negatively one of these three aspects or more of them. So from a ransomware point of view, when we look at what ransomware is, it's a type of malware. So malware comes from malicious software that uses encryption to compromise the availability of data and sometimes system files with a view to demanding payment for a decryption key. So it's focused on mainly on the availability of the data. So it encrypts that data, and basically you can't get that data back unless you pay a ransom, which in theory they will provide you with a decryption key so that you can get the data back. So that's the theory of how ransomware works. What has happened though over time, and I'm sure Jake will talk about this a little bit as well, is that ransomware has evolved, and the way that ransomware is delivered has evolved as well. So this is really how it started. So the malware is delivered in some way, so that often comes via email. So a phishing email, for instance, where you click on a link, or it might be an attachment. That typically is the initial kind of delivery mechanism, although there are other ways of doing it, but via email is by far the most common way. The malware is then executed, so the software, the malicious software, will actually run on somebody's device. Quite often there'll be a spread of that as well, so the malware will spread across different devices, different machines within the organization, and then basically when the malware executes, the data is, we could say, kidnapped, right? So that's the encryption of the data. So that means that the data is unreadable to you, and it's unreadable to the system. Normally these days, ransomware is concentrated on data files, so things like Word documents or Office documents, for instance, could be text files. Some ransomware will also encrypt system type files, which can render machines unusable as well. And then once the encryption has been completed, you're locked out of those files, you'll be notified of that, and then in some manner the ransom is demanded. So you'll be told that you need to pay a ransom in order to be able to obtain a decryption key and to recover those files. And then again, theoretically, you pay the ransom, your decryption key is delivered back to you, you can decrypt your data and get it back, and then obviously you can recover that data and move on. You'll notice that I said in theory, so bear in mind that if you are dealing with a ransomware attack, you are effectively dealing with a criminal. So criminals aren't always honest, obviously. So in terms of what they're saying with the decryption keys, so you may or may not get that decryption key. So that's a risk that obviously has to be weighed up. And also there's been a bit of an evolution over the last few years of ransomware, because what happens with all of these types of cyber attacks is that they will evolve over time, because people like myself, people like Jake will be doing things to try and prevent cyber attacks from happening. So we'll be putting new software in place, you might be putting new policies in place, new processes, you might be training your staff to spot them a little bit better. And so over time, people get better at preventing this from happening. And so the cyber criminals have to evolve and find new ways of overcoming the security controls that organizations put in place. So that happens constantly. It's a constant cycle. It's a constant battle, if you like, of cyber criminals against cyber defenders and technical solutions, and antivirus software, and also generally cybersecurity that you put in place. So there's constant battle going on. So how ransomware specifically has evolved over the last few years is in a few different ways. So firstly, in a lot of cases, cyber criminals will get access into your organization in some way, which firstly would enable them to execute ransomware attacks. But before they do that, they'll actually look and find the data that's important to you. So that might be on file shares, it might be in cloud-based solutions, it might be within your backups, and they'll take a copy of that data first. So if you go back to that CIA thing that I was talking about earlier on, confidentiality, integrity, availability, at that point they've compromised both the availability of the data. That's going to be compromised through executing the ransomware and the encryption, but they've also compromised the confidentiality of that data because they've got a copy of it. So the reason that they will exfiltrate that data first is because one of the ways that you can guard against this a ransomware attack is to have good backups of your data. So rather than saying, okay, well, we're going to pay for the decryption key, you can say, okay, well, we don't need to do that because we can recover our data from our backups. So that's good if you can do that. But if the criminal already has a copy of the data as well, if that data is sensitive in any way, so it might be intellectual property data that has value, it might be personal data that has a value to an individual and a value from the point of view of you being pursued by the ICO for a data breach. If that data is compromised, then the cyber criminal, the ransomware gangs can threaten to release that data into the public domain if you don't pay the ransom. So there's two reasons that they're giving you that you might need to pay that ransom, even if you can recover from it. The second thing aligned to that as well is the backups are quite often compromised and corrupted. So if you have backups that are where the backup system is physically or logically connected to your main systems, then some of the sophisticated ransomware gangs will spend some time making sure that they can get access to those backups and can compromise those backups in some way. So they either take copies of the backups so they can get the copies of the data as above, or they might corrupt the backups or stop the backups from working for a period of time. Lots of organizations have a gap where they don't perhaps test or monitor their backups on a regular basis. So it might be that by the time the ransomware attack occurs, the backups haven't been running for quite some time and you don't have a recent backup to go back to, so you don't have a recovery mechanism. So the cyber criminals are obviously trying to make it more compelling for you to have to pay the ransom to them to decrypt the data. You also now get things like double encryption, so there might be two different ransomware gangs and two different types of ransom involved. Where they'll encrypt the data once you pay the ransom, and then they say, okay, now you have to go and talk to our friends over here because they've also encrypted the data and you might need to pay them a ransom as well. Repeat attacks are very common as well, particularly when you do pay the ransom. So general advice is to not pay the ransom unless you absolutely have to. Realistically, from an operational point of view, sometimes you have to do that. And that's a whole big conversation we could have around that. But if you do pay the ransom, there's two kind of really key things to understand. Firstly, you may not get a decryption key. It's possible that they may not provide it to you. Secondly, if you do pay the ransom, obviously then you're kind of almost your card is marked, right? Because they know that you will pay the ransom. They know that you don't have mechanisms in place to recover, and so you have to go for that last resort. So it might be that 3 months later they come back and do the same thing. Also, which is part of facilitating that, is that a lot of organizations, when they do pay the ransom, if the decryption key does work and they get their data back, they don't do a very good job of cleaning up and looking at the root cause analysis and understanding how it happened in the first place and improving the security to prevent it happening again. Because once you've paid it, you've got your data back, you kind of get back to day-to-day operations, and maybe think it's all done. But the same vulnerabilities that you had in your systems and in your processes that allowed that attack to happen in the first place will still exist if you don't go through and meticulously find out what happened and close those gaps. So the repeat attacks are quite common. So business impacts from a ransomware attack. So the first one and the most obvious one is lost productivity. So some of you may have seen some of the the larger scale ransomware attacks that have happened. So things like Maersk, things like companies like KP, for instance. One of the big impacts is actually just the data that you need to run your business, whether it's customer data, whether it's logistics data to be able to process orders, organize deliveries, schedules. You don't have access to that data. So you can't run the business basically unless you have a really good business resilience plan for catering for that type of scenario where you can't have the access to the electronic data. And that can run into days, months, weeks, months even. And obviously that leads to financial loss potentially. It leads to reputational damage, not only the fact that you've been compromised, but also the fact that you've not been prepared perhaps to deal with that in the way that a client or a customer would expect you to be prepared. Also, you've got financial loss, which is indirect. So you've got, firstly, you've got the fact that you may have to pay a ransom. Secondly, you've got the financial loss from the loss of productivity and the loss of reputation and loss of customers. And thirdly, you might have things like fines. So the Information Commissioner's Office, if there's a personal data breach involved, if you're in the financial industry, you might get fines from the FCA. So that's quite a common financial loss as well. And then around the reputational damage, obviously loss of trust from your clients, customers, and potentially loss of a sort of competitive edge. There's a flip side to the competitive edge thing, where I think if you're doing a good job around cybersecurity and you can articulate that well, then it can give you a competitive edge over some of your competitive organizations. So those are the business impacts. Why does it happen? So motivation, there's different types of cyber criminal groups, which I know Jake is going to talk about a little bit, and they all have slightly different motivations. But from a ransomware point of view, typically the motivation is it's monetary, right? So there's a gang who want to get some money out of you. Right? That's their key motivation. One of the things that enables ransomware and other types of cybercrime to happen is that many organizations still aren't well prepared, both in terms of prevention, but also in terms of resilience. So how you deal with cyber attacks when they do happen. And we see sort of, I guess, two main examples of this from a sort of commercial perspective. One is this kind of some of these misconceptions that we have on these slides, right? These are things that we hear all the time, where organizations aren't necessarily particularly worried about cybersecurity or the cyber threat because nothing's ever happened, or they have an IT company, so they outsource their IT and they think that's all looked after by the IT company, or you have cyber insurance, so you're reliant on that. Lots of misconceptions about putting data in the cloud and it immediately being, super secure just because you put it in the cloud, but there's something called a shared security model there that you have to be aware of. So there's lots of misconceptions, and I think that's this is really what we're talking about here, right? It's where you have exactly that. You have a misconception. That's one example. I think the other example, and this is true of a lot of organizations, is you do know there's an issue, you do know that there's more that you need to do, but perhaps you don't really know where to go for that advice, or who to ask, or who to trust with good advice. So I just did a quick search on Google on this question, and you can see there's 180 million results to try and answer that question. So the good news is that there is lots of good information out there that you can get. There's lots of help out there, and one of the things that, obviously, one of the reasons that I got involved with the IoD and became the cybersecurity ambassador for the IoD is to try and help provide some of that information and do some signposting as to where you can go to get some good advice. So just looking at those two things, we've got percentages of organizations. So these are government figures from a study that they do every year. Percentage of organizations with board members or trustees that have a responsibility for cybersecurity. You can see in a lot of cases that's well below 50% for different sizes and different types of organizations. And it is really a if the responsibility is not assumed at a high level within an organization, you're always on the back foot for trying to implement a good kind of cybersecurity posture and resilience. The second set of figures on there is around percentage of organizations who have taken some actions around cybersecurity and understanding what their threat level is. So looking at the third one down, I think on their risk assessment covering cybersecurity risks. So really having a good understanding of what the risks are in your organization. Only around the 30% mark of organizations have done that in the last 12 months. So if you don't have a really good understanding of what the threats are to your organization, then it's difficult to know whether you're putting the right controls in place and the preventative measures in place. So you do have responsibilities in organizations to do things, both to your clients, but also to yourselves as business owners and business leaders. And it might seem a little bit unfair, right? Because all of this actually is a crime. That's really something that really important to remember. Cyber attacks are a crime, but unfortunately, whilst that's the case, that doesn't mean that we can kind of not do anything about it ourselves, right? We have to kind of accept that it's almost a fact of life, and we have to do something about it ourselves. We have to take our own responsibility to try and prevent things from happening. So there's certain things that you can control. There's certain things that you can't. You can't control the fact that there's ransomware gangs out there. You can't control the fact that some of the technical solutions can't keep up with the cyber criminals. But there are things that you can control. Lots of things within your organisation, which we'll talk about. Quick slide on technology. This is really just to demonstrate that, again, one of the misconceptions that's just quite common is that we can solve the problem with technical solutions only. So it's all a technical problem and we can put technical solutions in place to solve it. This slide is about 2-3 years old now, actually, and it's all different cybersecurity solutions, technical solutions that you can buy to try and protect your organization. And I think the key point from this is if there was one solution that could solve the cybersecurity problem, then most of these wouldn't exist because you just buy that one. The reality is that there are lots of good technical solutions out there, but none of them will do everything that you need to do from a preventative point of view. So there's lots of different solutions that you need from a technical point of view. There's lots of other things that you need to do in terms of good policies, good process, having a strategy, training people, making sure people are aware, and being vigilant on an ongoing basis. So some good cybersecurity fundamentals to talk about. One is the thing that I mentioned a couple of minutes ago, which is understanding what is critical to your business. Every business is different in terms of the data they have, the systems they have, and what's really important to them. Some companies may have personal sensitive data on their clients that's really important, and they have to really protect that well. Some organizations will be more interested in intellectual property that they have. So we have pharmaceutical clients, for instance, who have to protect the IP around the drugs that they're developing. Understand the vulnerabilities and threats to those crown jewels, if you like. Assess the risks and the impacts, again, to your organization. And you need to understand what your own risk tolerance is as an organization, and then apply controls to reduce or mitigate those risks. And accept that some risk is okay sometimes. The reality is that we can't be 100% secure. So we have to try and evolve and try and increase our security and our prevention all the time. But there will be some things that sometimes we'll decide that a risk is an acceptable level, and that's okay as long as it's a considered risk. The human element is really important. So I know Jake's going to talk about this as well, so I won't talk too much, but phishing accounts for over 80% of breaches, of which ransomware is one kind, and they're very hard to stop with technology alone. So we have to consider the human element to that. Phishing methods, typical, you'll have seen lots of these. Changing the from address, so it looks like it's coming from somebody that you know. Obscuring or fake links, so links that look like they go to one place, but they actually go to somewhere else. Spelling, grammar, and formatting errors, one of those are things to look out for. And often these types of emails will come with a sense of urgency. So there's a lot of psychology associated with phishing attacks and cyber attacks, where they'll try and play on human nature, the fact that we all want to help, the fact that we're all busy, we're all in a hurry, we're all, if an email seems to come from somebody within the organization of seniority, then we might want to deal with that quickly and maybe not ask too many questions. All of those things are within the design of phishing emails. So just skip over that one. Just in terms of putting cybersecurity measures in place, and this is generally not just on ransomware, but cybersecurity in general, there are some good frameworks to consider. So a lot of you will have heard of Cyber Essentials, maybe ISO 27001, but there's lots of others out there as well, which can be really helpful in terms of you understanding what you need to do from a cybersecurity point of view. The gap that we talked about earlier on, where a lot of organizations, a lot of leaders don't really know, who to ask, who to, or how to approach it. So some of these frameworks can be really helpful. What I would say is different frameworks apply better to some organizations than others. So it's really good to get some advice on which one might be, or which of these might be most appropriate for your organization. Just on a ransomware note particularly, this is some advice which is from the National Cybersecurity Centre website, which I'm going to mention, just talk a little bit more about in a minute. I think Jake's going to talk about too. But this is particular actions to take very high level around ransomware. So the first one is making regular backups. And when we do backups, there's something called a 3-2-1 rule that's really good to follow. And so that is 3 copies of data, 2 of those on different types of media. So that might be 2 different cloud-based backups, or it might be one is a cloud-based backup, one is a physical backup. And one of those should be offline or immutable. An immutable backup is something that's maybe a cloud-based backup, but it can't be altered within a particular time frame by anybody, even by the people who are doing the backup. And the reason you have that immutable backup is to prevent the corruption or the corruption of the backup that we talked about earlier on when we talked about some of the ransomware techniques that they use. So the backups are really important. Preventing malware from being delivered and spreading to devices. So there's a whole bunch of things around there, some of them technical, things like firewalls, things like email filtering, but also non-technical. So things like training and awareness of everybody are really, really critical as a way to try and prevent malware and other types of ransomware and other types of malware from being delivered, and also spreading across devices as well. So there's some technical solutions that you can put in place to, from a networking point of view, to reduce ransomware's ability to spread. Patching devices, installing those annoying Windows updates that come along all the time. All of those things are really important in terms of that prevention. Also, they're important for preventing malware from running on devices. Things like not giving people admin rights on their machines, running antivirus, anti-malware solutions. And then the last one is about preparing for an incident. As I mentioned earlier on, that sort of 100% prevention is not realistic. So we can do lots of things to reduce the probability of any type of cyber attack or malware or ransomware happening, but we're never going to prevent it 100%. So being prepared for something happening and knowing how to deal with it in advance and who to contact and who to call, who needs to be involved, the resources that you need is critically important, because the way that you deal with a cyber attack or a ransomware attack, if it does happen, will have a huge bearing on how well you come out of that situation as an organization. So some other things, important things to do, allocate resources to business with business commitment. So that might be people within your organization. It might be some outsourced provision of services as well. Policies are actually not very exciting, but quite important from a security point of view. because they set the standards for your organization. And when you're deciding on technical solutions or things that you need to do when you're outsourcing, those policies will be there to give you good guidance. Defining responsibilities within your organization, awareness training is so important. The human element really important. Incident response planning I mentioned, and aligned to that as well, disaster recovery and business continuity planning, which are distinct from the incident response planning side. So making sure that you have plans in place for if you don't have access to your systems, you know how to recover them, and if you can't recover them within a good time frame, how are you going to continue running your business for the days, weeks, potentially months that it takes to do that cleanup. So from an incident response plan point of view, as I mentioned, 100% security is unrealistic. So act as if it's inevitable and plan for something to happen. And the ultimate goal of doing that is really to try and reduce the amount of decision making that you have to do when you're in a really critical, almost panicked situation. Because the more you can look at that objectively and be prepared is going to help you come out of that situation much better. Maximize containment opportunities, so really limit the damage of a cyber attack, and also to communicate effectively both internally and externally, and to help prevent future similar attacks. These are all things that we're trying to achieve from having those kind of incident response plans in place. So there's a little bit more on that. Different standards as well, different types of incident response plans that you can have, different levels. Pick what works for you as an organization. So it might be as simple as having a kind of a flow chart that you follow through, or a process. You might have a checklist, or you might have a more comprehensive document if you're a larger organization, and with training around that and all sorts of things. So having a look at incident response planning is something I'd highly recommend. So in terms of resources to help you with some of these things, there's some really good free resources out there. So the National Cybersecurity Centre, I encourage everybody to look on that website as a first port of call. Some really good advice on there, backed by GCHQ, and lots of different advice catered for or tailored for different audiences. So if you're a small business, a medium business, a large business, if you're in a particular sector, also from a personal point of view, securing your personal devices, lots of information on there about that as well. So National Cybersecurity Centre is a really good place to look. We also have cyber resilience centres, which Jake's going to talk about. Cyber East is a cybersecurity cluster. So I'll put the links for all of these in the Q&A. Or we'll provide them at the end. And then also just on our own website as well, there's a knowledge base on there that you can go to if you've got any questions about cybersecurity. A lot of them will be answered on there. And then obviously there's the policing, protect and prevent units, which is where Jake sits. And so I'm going to hand over to him to give you some more information on that and some more detail on some of the things that I've talked about. Jake, over to you.
Let me just share my screen. You might have to unshare your screen first, Darren. Right, here we go. If you could let me know once you've you can see that.
Yeah, that's
all good, Jake.
Perfect. Right. Yes. So a lot of what Darren has said does cross over into what I'm about to talk about, but I think that's the nature of cybersecurity anyway. So it doesn't hurt to get a bit of a refresher, but you'll hear a bit about sort of the perspective from the police. So as I mentioned, my name is Jake. I'm a cyber prevent and protect officer for the Serious Fraud and Cyber Unit in Hertfordshire. So every force will have a similar or an equivalent of myself. Today we're going to talk predominantly or almost exclusively about protect. Prevent is about diverting people away from criminality. So we're focusing on Protect, which is your typical crime prevention advice, guidance, training, briefings, etc. Right, so today, we cover a lot in our sort of area of business. Certainly our investigators and our network investigators and our fraud and cyber experts. I sit on the sort of more on the crime prevention side, of training up businesses, schools, charities, everyone from sort of one-person band right through to multinational companies based in Hertfordshire. We're currently exploring collaborations with EE and other sort of major names that are based in the county. I won't go in too much detail as to what all of these are and how all of them will relate to you, and how you may be impacted by them. We're going to focus on these three things. So I know today the main focus is ransomware, which is a form of malicious software, as has already been mentioned. But to get to that stage, there are a few other potential sort of ways that, or MOs, methods or ways that the criminals can actually gain access to your systems in the first place. And that's obviously through something we already know, we're already well aware about, well aware of, which is phishing, which is, we see it on a daily basis through our emails, through text messages, scams, etc. And then obviously another technique called account compromise or email compromise, sometimes also called business email compromise, which will be more relevant to yourself. So we're going to talk about these, which leads us quite nicely to ransomware. So the estimated cost of cybercrime globally, I'm not going to ask the question because I haven't got too much time, but the answer is $3 trillion. The NCA, who we work very closely with the National Cybercrime Unit and the National Cybersecurity Centre, which is part of GCHQ, estimate that this will go up to around $10 trillion by 2026. But just to put this in perspective, 3 trillion is more, I think, I can't remember exactly how much, but it's more than the GDP of the UK. So it is big business. We're going to talk some stats now to get your juices flowing with all this. Some of these are quite staggering. 90% of organisations have not sent staff on cybersecurity training. That is concerning. We all know about sort of budgets and resources that are tight, but we often find this is the case, certainly in the smaller businesses and medium-sized businesses. And I think it's also because people don't realize that it's a problem. It's something that's not visible. It's not like your typical crime types that you can sort of visually see. Burglaries are easy to understand, theft, that kind of thing. But it's often something, because you can't see it, you don't think it affects you until it's too late. And it's usually the case. It's very much like a burglar alarm. If you don't, people get a burglar alarm once they've been burgled. The whole idea of my role existing and lots of sort of positions and roles that sort of Dan alluded to exists is to try and get people thinking about this and try and get people thinking about cybersecurity before they need to go and get that burglar alarm. 41% of UK consumers claim they will never return to a business after a data breach. That goes back to that reputational damage piece that Darren was talking about. And that is, and I would say I quite firmly fit into that 41%. There's a number of businesses that when I see that they've negligently handled my data and it's resulted in a breach, I will actively close those accounts or request those accounts be closed. Obviously, there's no 100% foolproof way to protect against an attack. Unfortunately, there's nothing out there. It's a combination of human and technological solutions. So it's not fair to just tar every breach with the same brush. But some companies are more less complacent than others, and some take it more seriously than others. So that is a real issue for businesses, is reputational damage. 90% of cyber data breaches were caused by human error. So they always say that adage of the human is the weakest link. It is also the strongest link, because as we'll find out shortly, the human, the employee, the employer, we all play a part in securing us and securing our data, securing the data of our organizations. But that said, 90% of data breaches are initiated through human error, clicking on a link, downloading an attachment, responding to something they believe to be genuine. £8,500 is the average annual cost after a business is breached. That has gone up slightly, and I think it is slightly higher for larger businesses as well. But that is, again, for a small company which didn't think that they were a target of cyber criminals, is quite a big chunk per year. One small business in the UK is attacked or successfully hacked every 19 seconds. 4 in 10 or 40% of small and medium-sized enterprises say they would struggle to recover from data loss. So today's advice and guidance that we're going to give is predominantly about preventing this in the first place. By the time you've found out that you are a victim of ransomware, it's often too late. There are lots of signs that you can potentially identify beforehand, or that your technological solutions can identify. And if your IT is being managed by a third-party IT company, sit down with them in a meeting for a couple of hours and work out exactly what they're doing to protect against you. Understand the language of cyber protect, so you can be more secure and sort of rest assured that things are happening. 80% of cyber attacks start in the supply chain. That's slightly concerning, because again, it may not even be your company itself that has been breached to begin with. It may be through a trusted partner. 65% of SMEs suffer a cyber attack from 2019 to 20, compared to 46% of all businesses. Again, that's quite staggering, isn't it? I think we all agree. 54% of all crime has a cyber element. So this is why we always bang this drum. I think that's also fraud as well. So more than 50% of all crime is cyber and fraud. So we understand the language of a lot of traditional crime. When it comes to cyber crime, which is over 50% of all crime, we are all lagging behind as a society. And lastly, before I bore you to death with too many stats, 83% of organizations were the victim of phishing, which is the most common attack type. So 83%, and these phishing emails are usually the precursor to something else. It's the way in to your company by clicking on a link or downloading a piece of remote access software or a piece of malicious software for the threat to get into your account or your system. So that is the main thing. So we are going to talk about phishing now. But before we do, I'm going to focus on these three. So the reputational damage and the financial cost, and the fact that companies don't, certainly small companies, struggle to recover once they've been targeted. I know Darren's mentioned this already, so I'm not going to dwell on it too much, but there are a number of direct and indirect costs we've already touched on already today. Reputational damage being a big one, but the financial cost. A lot of insurers now, it used to be the case that insurers, people would rest assured and get a bit complacent. Insurers will cover the cost of ransom, the cost of ransoms that you would incur or be threatened with by criminals. Now they're moving away from that because obviously it's not advised by government, by law enforcement, and it just perpetuates the issue. So you've got lots of different things, lots of different costs that are in play here. I will send a copy of some of these slides out afterwards, so you don't have to worry about sort of taking it all on board now. So we went back to the 90% of cyber data breaches being caused by human error, and the fact that 83% of organizations were victim of phishing. So we're going to talk about phishing for a little bit. Now, you're probably all aware of what it is, but there are different types of phishing. Phishing, the standard phishing, your bog standard phishing, emails sent en masse. We all get them asking us for X, Y, and Z, poorly spelled messages, and they're usually, some of them are not really addressed to yourselves. They'll just be addressed to, the name on your email or your email address, that kind of thing. They'll be quite easy to sort of weed out, so to speak. And then you've got the next level up, which is what's called spear phishing, and that's where phishing attempts are personalized to their targets. Research is required, things like social media, which we'll give you a case study shortly on how a CEO was researched online through social media, through LinkedIn. Privacy settings were either not locked down, or they were deliberately open to allow oversharing. And that's where a lot of cyber criminals will target sort of bigger fish. And then from spear phishing, you get up to whaling. Now, obviously, you can see a running theme going on here. Whaling is where high-level decision makers are being targeted. If you think about CEOs, directors of companies, this is where criminals will take a lot of time to do a lot of research into that person, and they will devise a bespoke campaign to target that person, which we'll give a brief example shortly. So there's a bit of a misconception about phishing emails. Obviously, we can see the obvious ones here. The email address itself is clearly not a Microsoft email address. High sales, not necessarily something you would say to an individual. And the actual URL that it points to is not a genuine Microsoft account, email, web address. But then if you can see the bottom left, Microsoft is spelled incorrectly. It's Microsoft without the second O. Now, there's a misconception that all of these spelling errors, grammatical errors, are sort of accidental through English not being the sort of first language. Now, that was the case a number of years back, and it probably still is the case for some of these. But we're now starting to see that these are deliberate errors. Spelling errors and grammatical errors are deliberate in a lot of these phishing emails, because it's a way for the criminals to triage whether or not you're a good target. If you're going to fall for an email like this, which has spelling errors, grammatical errors in there, you are going to be a prime target. So they look at you and go, right, if they've fallen for this, they're going to fall for what's coming next. And that sort of puts you on their radar. So it is actually, in a lot of cases, a deliberate tactic by the criminals to hook people in. So malicious software. So malicious software is basically software that's designed to do something bad. So it could be damaging a system, it could be stealing data, secretly getting into a system and monitoring information and sending it back. There are many different types of malware disguised in many different forms. So you might have something that's designed from the ground up by a criminal, by a cyber criminal or cybercrime group, or you might have a piece of software that's totally legitimate, like a piece of software a few years ago called CCleaner, and that had the genuine piece had some malicious software integrated into it. So when that was sent out to customers and people were downloading it, they thought they were downloading the genuine piece, and actually it had some it was obviously malicious software, and it was doing all sorts of bits and pieces to the system. So they do come in all sorts of shapes and sizes. They can be triggered by opening a file, an email link, or downloading an attachment. So if you've seen in the past a phishing email that appears to have an Excel or Word document attached to it, or even a zip file, these are highly likely, if not certainly, going to be some sort of malicious software which will execute as you download. And then obviously the payload downloads to the device, and then it does whatever it needs to do. And obviously in the case of ransomware, it starts that process, which we'll talk about. So malicious attachments make up 43% of all malware downloads. This is how a lot of ransomware gets into accounts. So it'll be on a phishing email, which will use a lot of social engineering to get you to convince you to download something or click on a link. And then before you know it, a few weeks later, a few months later, you may well be subject to a ransomware attack. So I really want to talk about this because it really underpins everything we've talked about. So every single phishing email that you receive, every single attempt that is made to try and get you to do something or manipulate you into doing the wrong thing is underpinned by social engineering. And that's just effectively three things you can boil it down to. So if you ever get overwhelmed and confused by something, if you're not sure if it's legitimate, think of these three things: emotions, authority, urgency. If you look at the typical text message, which we've all received over the last sort of year or so, pay $1.99, $2.99 to deliver a parcel, or to redeliver a parcel, that covers emotions, authority, and urgency. It's usually Royal Mail or somewhere which you think, well, they're obviously an expert in that field. I'm waiting for a parcel. I might not be, but you think you are, and it's from what appears to be a reputable organisation, or it could be pretending to be purporting to be police or HMRC. So it's a position of authority. And then it's the emotions of fear of loss or fear of not gaining something. If I don't do this, if I don't do that, I'm going to lose this, or I'm scare you into doing something. So it's the use of emotions. And then you've got the urgency. There's always a need to do something now, immediately. Click on this, pay this invoice. So just if you ever get overwhelmed, or if your employers employees, ever get overwhelmed by the language and they're not quite sure if something's genuine, apply these 3 stages: emotions, authority, and urgency, and it should stand them in good stead. So business email compromise, one of the big things, one of the big ways to get into an account or to actually initiate a process of carrying out ransomware may be a business email compromise. And that would be hacking, spoofing, or impersonation of employees or senior leaders to get you or your supplier to pay money into their account often, or changing a regular payment, and basically compromise your email and send different bank details to people. Now, we should have processes and procedures in place in companies to prevent bank account details being changed, prevent invoices being paid unless they go through a certain process or system. But some companies still don't have these in place. Sometimes email compromise also leads to allowing access into wider systems and databases, which could be the sort of precursor to ransomware attacks. But this is really important. I wanted to touch on BEC for a number of different reasons. This case study is quite shocking, and unfortunately, it's quite prevalent across the UK and across the world. So this example, company A, reputable advertising agency. The CEO is very active on social media and LinkedIn. Professional and personal postings are together. So we see how this person communicates, the CEO, how he interacts with and signs off messages, and how he interacts with people, the nuances and the inflections in his wording, etc., etc. He talked about his, a couple of things which you think perfectly innocuous. He's talking about his favorite coffee shop. He's got photographs of the food he has at the coffee shop and the drinks, etc. And he talked about his holiday. And obviously he talked about his new clients. So they announced the signing of company B. And you think to yourself, this actually makes sense. This is what social media is all about, right? LinkedIn, social media, we're going to show off our successes, and we're going to talk about ourselves, etc., etc. People overshare, and that's the nature of it. But then the CEO decides he's going to, well, obviously goes on holiday for 2 weeks. He makes it very clear that he's not to be disturbed. In actual fact, he probably won't be able to be disturbed anyway for most of it, because he won't have phone signal where he's going. So this is the prime fertile ground for a cyber criminal, because with a lot of this information, you think on their own or on its own, it looks a bit, you think, how could this be used to extort money, or how can this be used to defraud money, shall we say, from a company? Well, in actual fact, an email was drafted with all this information sort of suggested in it. It was basically the criminal had done its research, and he'd emailed the head of finance, basically saying, this new client has got this invoice. We need this signed off as soon as possible. Otherwise, we're going to breach the contract and we're going to lose company B, and they've only just signed up to us. Please get this done as soon as possible. I'll obviously take you to my favorite coffee shop, which they all knew about because they knew this person. I'm going on holiday. I'm literally there now. So I'm not going to be able to respond to any more messages. And then they signed off. Let's say, for the sake of argument, this person was called James. They signed off as Jim, and obviously all the wording was carefully researched. That email, you think to yourself, well, how's that going to help? Well, actually, the head of finance ended up paying that invoice out of fear of losing this new client, and they lost £25,000. So if you go back to emotions, authority, and urgency, if the CEO is telling you to do something, or you're going to lose this major client, which they've announced publicly, that's the emotions. You've got the authority of being the CEO, and you've got the urgency. And that all came from a bit of phishing, a bit of account compromise, various different techniques, which I won't go into too much detail now. But it's all about understanding who we're talking to and who we're receiving messages from. And if it doesn't feel right, check in with someone, check in with colleagues, check in with staff. But that's, it's unfortunately that's what we're seeing quite regularly is this impersonation. Hopefully you can hear the audio for this.
Oh, hiya, can I help?
Hot chocolate.
What's the name?
Joelle.
What was the name?
Alex.
Alex. There you go, Johnny. If you like our Facebook page, we give you a free hot drink and a free pastry.
We have a new like for Damien. We have a new like for Damien.
Hey, Carly, are you standing by?
Standing by. Hi there, can I help?
Yeah, I just liked your Facebook page.
Okay, I'll search Facebook now.
I'm searching Google.
Have a phone number.
I've got his email address.
Okay, Carly, are you ready for information on Damien?
Yep, I am.
Mother's maiden name is he banks with
Carly, this is the girl coming in now with the blue scarf.
What's her name? Nicholas.
Nicola. His date of birth, 7th May. She lives at 38A.
Just be a couple of seconds.
2 children at age 4 and 6. Previous address. She's got the postcode.
Yep, got it. Damien, age 26 and a fitness instructor.
How do you know that?
Brody, who goes to UCL. Martin, who went to South Thames College. Assistant psychologist at Great Ormond Street. How did you know?
That is... I don't understand.
Oh, better.
You know I'm a Christian as well.
Oh, yeah, we know everything about you, Martin. Thank you. Nice to meet you, Anna from Russia.
So there are a lot of conversations we can have, which obviously we haven't got time today, about sharing, about oversharing, about information that should and shouldn't be out there. You know, if you're going to be carrying out business work on a device or on social media, make sure it's separate to your personal accounts, etc. And just make sure you have that deconfliction between the two, because you may be giving away information or leaking information unintentionally, which could be used against you. Now, the example I gave was an extreme example, but it's definitely possible out there. So ransomware, it's already been talked about, so I'm not going to go into too much detail, but what I will say is it started off as a double threat. So by the time you realize you've been a victim of ransomware, chances are you've had your data exfiltrated and stolen already, and that may take a couple of days, it may take a couple of weeks, it may take a couple of months. So you might come up with on the right hand side you can see that that image that will come up, and it will tell you you've become your files have been encrypted and you are now subject to a ransomware. By the time you've seen that, it may be too late. There may be a number of signs. It could have been an email a couple of months prior where someone clicked on a link or downloaded an attachment, and that process started. Now, there are ways, there's technological solutions out there. Your IT suppliers should be in a position to detect suspicious activity. But by the time generally you've seen this, it's usually happened and the data has been exfiltrated. Now that's the double sort of scam, shall we say. The triple scam now is where law enforcement and government are saying you should not be paying ransoms because actually it perpetuates the problem and it means you're more susceptible to being attacked again, basically. They're now targeting customer bases for the company. So if a company's not going to pay, they're going to now target, or we've now started to see certain groups targeting the customer base of the company. So that's not, obviously, you know, their data's been stolen, and they're not, you know, not just that, they're now going to be targeted directly by the scammers and the criminals. So it's definitely worth getting ahead of the game. The stat here worth noting is 74% of all ransomware payments go to Russia-backed groups. That was last year prior to the Ukraine war. Motivations for cybercrime like this is obviously financial predominantly, but there are others. They're ideological, political. Some of them are actually there purely to try and get people to change their ways in a strange way. As you can see, some of these criminals are so sophisticated. One company in particular, I keep calling them companies, one cyber criminal or cyber gang in particular actually offered, they have a customer service method, so you can talk about what's Bitcoin, what's cryptocurrency, how to buy it, how to you know, basically pay their way, and actually how to protect your system afterwards. Now, one company was so annoyed, but then at the same time so complacent about cybersecurity, they paid the ransom. They were given cybersecurity advice by the company. The company said, yeah, we're not interested. 2 weeks later, do we know what happened? They struck again and targeted them again. And we're talking about basics like multi-factor or two-factor authentication, which wasn't implemented by the company to begin with. Usually it's the first thing that companies then implement, if they haven't, after an attack. But this company didn't even do that. So the ransomware gang came in again and did exactly the same thing again and took another amount of money from them. And it's worth noting, you know, it doesn't matter what your company does. It doesn't matter how big or small your company is, and it doesn't matter what kind of information you hold. The criminals bank on the fact that it's worth something to you. We have, you know, it's not just defense companies or government or infrastructure or supply, suppliers, major suppliers, or public services that get targeted. It's small companies, and that's intentionally as well as unintentionally, by the nature of the way that everything's connected, the Internet of Things. These malicious softwares and various different attacks will inevitably find their way to other systems and other devices and other networks. So just because you don't feel like you have have something worth stealing or extorting you for, it doesn't mean that you are not a target. We've seen a number of companies that have been, and they may be, for the sake of argument, a florist. And you think, well, how is that going to help a gang in Russia or a gang in Eastern Europe or in China somewhere? They're not interested. They're looking for that £30,000, or that, you know, if you're a bigger company, you know, a couple of million, they're looking for that payday. So don't be of that sort of mind that it won't affect you, because it affects all of us. There are a number of things we can do, which I'm not going to talk through now because I'm mindful we're already over time. But just to reiterate what Darren was saying, backups are so essential. Other than 2FA, not having a workable backup is one of the big things we hear from businesses all the time. They say, "Oh, don't worry, we've been targeted, but we do backups every week." But no one's checked those backups for 6 months. And then they go to check it, and the backup's out of date, or it's stopped working, or it's failed for some reason. And before you know it, they are in a real problem. So we always say, and I'm sure Darren's already mentioned it anyway, about the amount of backups you should have. But if it's not backed up in more than 2 places, it doesn't exist. And that's the way you need to be approaching backups to your information. We've had some companies which don't actually get back up to speed for a number of weeks and months because they haven't got the information. They work on pen and paper because their computer systems are down and they've lost data. There's been risk to vulnerable victims and vulnerable customers because information has been lost or inaccessible. And just to reiterate again what Darren was saying, just because you pay a ransom, it doesn't mean A, it's not going to happen again, and B, your data isn't out there, because your data has highly likely been stolen. And if they confirm that they've got it and they've stolen it, then they have access to it. So you have to trust the word of a cyber gang to say that they've deleted it or that they've not shared it anywhere else. So I'd rather be in a situation where I've prevented it in the first place and done what I can to prevent it than it be out there. So I'm going to leave these. I'm going to rush through these quite quickly because we haven't got much time. But there is a live cyber attack number that you can call via Action Fraud here, which I'll put in the chat later, or send it over. NCSC, really essential for everything. So if you want to do things like what's called exercise in a box, the NCSC has a variety of different ways that businesses can prepare and protect against these attacks. There's lots of advice and guidance. They've got some great infographics on ransomware. So please do check out the NCSC website here. And then similarly, if you are in this region, or in fact, every region now has a cyber resilience centre. The Eastern Cyber Resilience Centre is the one that covers Hertfordshire, Norfolk, Suffolk, Kent, Essex, Bedfordshire and Cambridgeshire. And it's effectively a collaboration between policing, industry and academia to increase cyber resilience in the region. And you're all entitled to free core membership, which will give you regular advice and guidance on what's out there. You can get support at reduced rate for cybersecurity if you don't have the finances or resources to pay for anything more substantial. But definitely sign up for CRC if you can. And lastly, I will leave you with these, which I will get out on an email as well. But there's a number of different places you can go. The Cyber Resilience Centre will signpost you to a lot of these anyway. But there are lots of places you can go for advice and guidance. Right, I've just powered right through that. And I imagine we've got a Q&A for the event now.
Oh, thanks, Jake. I think Darren's been going through and answering the Q&As for us. So there's none left in the chat box at the moment. So if there are any new questions, please do feel free to add them in. But yeah, conscious that we have run over time slightly, but it just an absolutely fantastic session. Just so much to jam pack in there, I believe. But no, and a huge thank you to Darren and Jake. It was very, very insightful, and hopefully everyone would agree that very beneficial as well. So I don't think we've got anything coming through at the moment. But what we can do, oh, we've got someone. Oh, thank you in there. But what we'll do is share the slides that both Darren and Jake have presented today, so we can get those sent over, a bit of a post-event feedback, and I can, if there's any questions that you do think of or want answering by Jake and Darren, then do let us know. But if there's any last minute bits from yourself, Darren or Jake, or you all good?
No, I don't think. I was just going to say the same, Cassie. If anybody's got any follow-up questions, yeah, please send them over to Cassie, and we'll answer those. Other than that, yeah, thank you all very much for attending.
Fantastic, lovely. Well, thank you very much, everyone. I'll finish this one now, and we look forward to seeing you again. We will be hosting these hopefully a bit more regularly. I think we've had really good interest with this particular event, and obviously there's so much to cover, so watch this space. But thanks again. Thank you very much, Jake and Darren, and we'll see you all soon.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, bye-bye.
Thanks, Jake. See you later.
Thank you.